Alrighty, so let's take a look at how we can create this spotlight effect for auto layout lists in 7.1. So you can see here that this is pretty much a 2-level hover effect where if I go near the cards or around the cards, all of them fade out a little bit. But then if I hover over one of the fade out cards, it goes all the way back up to full opacity. We're going to be achieving this just with CSS, and you don't really need to have any specific settings applied to the section itself. So feel free to adjust these and design them however it is that you want. This is the layout that I'm going to be working with, which is pretty simple. And we're just going to hop right into the code. The first thing that we need to do is create an overlay for each of the cards. Now, there are different ways to achieve the spotlight effect, but I personally like the overlay approach because it doesn't conflict if you have any sort of global animation applied to the whole site. So because I want that overlay to sit on top of each of the cards, I'm going to be using a pseudo element to create it, and I'm going to be using the card itself as the anchor to be able to position it and give it the exact same width and height. So let's go ahead and take a look here inside the inspect element tool and start creating our selector. So if you're familiar with the structure of auto layout sections, you know that we usually have, apart from a bunch of other containers, we have this container that is an UL element that carries the class of that specific type of auto layout. So in this case, because I'm working with a simple list, I see the class of user items list simple, which is the one that I'm going to be using in my code to apply this customization to any auto layout simple list that I have on the site. If you needed to make this a little bit more narrowed down or just laser focus on specific sections on your client site, then what you can do instead is use either the data section ID or an anchor link for this customization. Again, I'm going to keep it fairly simple, so I'm just going to be using this class here. And then we're going to target the list items themselves, which have a class of list items. So let's go ahead and use that class in here. And now we're going to be targeting all of the list items within any auto layout simple list on the site. Again, as I mentioned before, if you need to make this more specific to your project, to specific sections, make sure to change this selector for either data section IDs, page IDs, anchor links, whatever it is that you want to narrow things down to specific sections on your project. All right, so now that we have the list item selected in here, we're going to create our pseudo element first. So let's go ahead and use an after. I want this to sit on top of the card itself, so I'm just going to use an after because that's just going to make it slightly easier. And the first thing I'm going to do is create here or add in there the content property. I'm going to set it to empty because I'm going to be creating an empty container that is just going to hold color to create the overlay. Next, I'm going to be setting here the height and the width. Because I want the overlay to cover the entirety of the height and the width of the card, I'm going to be using here 100%. So let's just do 100% of the height and the width. Then, because I want the overlay to actually sit on top of the card and not next to it or above it or below it, I'm going to be using position absolute to be able to float it on top of the card. Now, right now, we're not really seeing anything happening on the screen because we don't have a color applied to it, so everything is completely transparent. So let's change that by adding a quick background color. You can see right now the things are happening, definitely they're happening, but not exactly how I want them to happen. So you can see how the overlay, this may be one of the overlays, it may be the 3 overlays just, collapsed into each other. But in any case, this is not really doing exactly what I want it to do. And that is because right now, the list item or the card itself is not acting as the anchor point, the reference point, the guideline, however you want to call it, for the overlay. The way that we have to change that is to basically target the element itself. So in this case, the card. Again, this is the overlay, this is the card itself. And what we're going to do is we're going to give this a position of relative. So once there is a position defined for the element, that is just going to help us use it as an anchor to be able to set the position and the dimensions of the overlay. So now the next thing that we need to do is just make sure that these two things are aligned, because I don't want to start over here. I want to start in this top left corner. So I'm going to be using top and left 0 offset to be able to make sure that this corner is aligned over here. So let's add that in our code. And now we have our overlays on top of our cards. Now the next thing we're going to do is actually make sure that the overlay is covering everything, because right now you can see how the button is sort of going on top of the overlay itself. Now this is definitely a look, so if you like this, you can go ahead and keep it this way, but I personally want that button to be covered as well. So I'm going to be making sure that I bring over the overlay on top of everything that the card has. And I'm going to be using set index 1 just to bring that a little bit forward into the foreground of the screen. All right, so now that we have the base set up in here, let's go ahead and change the color. So I'm going to be using here 255, 255, 255, and setting this to 0.9 alpha just to see a little bit of the content of the card behind the overlay. And now that we have this here, we're almost done. The next thing that we need to do is basically just create the hover mode itself. So the first thing we need to do is make sure that this overlay is not showing when the page loads. So the way that we're going to do that is by giving this an opacity of 0. And before I forget, we actually need to set one more declaration in here just to make sure that we're still able to click on the card or any element that the card has when the overlay is still present. Because right now this is set to opacity 0. And then if I try to click on the card, nothing is really clickable at the moment because I don't have the card set to fully clickable. I do have a tutorial on that, by the way, if you want to check it out. But right now the cards are not fully clickable. However, the buttons are, but right now you can see that I can't really interact with them. That is because the overlay is still on top of everything, even though we can't see it because of that opacity 0. So it's conflicting with our ability to click through the button. To make sure that that doesn't happen and that we can actually click through, we're going to give the overlay a pointer events value of none. And that is just going to allow us to make the overlay sort of see-through so that we can actually interact with whatever it is behind it. So right now you can see that even if I turn up the opacity and make it fully fade, I can still touch the button behind it. So that's the goal. All right, let's go back into our opacity. Again, we're going to keep this as 0 because we want this to be the initial state of the customization. We don't want to see the overlay firsthand. We just want to see it when we're hovering over the container. So to be able to create that first level of hover mode, what we're going to do is we're going to select a container that is holding the cards so that when we interact or enter the area of that container, that is when the overlay is going to turn its opacity all the way up to 1. So here, depending on how big you want the area to be for that hover mode to be activated, you can choose a different container. So if I were to choose the container that is holding each of the cards, again, here we have each of the separate cards and they're all sitting within this parent container that's called user items list simple, which is the one that we're referring to up here. If we wanted to use this as the trigger for the hover mode, that means that if we interact with any part of this area that is being highlighted right now on the screen, that is when the hover mode is going to be activated. That is when the cards are going to be faded out. If we wanted a bigger area, that means that we could use something like this, for example. So this container that is called user items list, this is pretty much holding the whole section. I mean, the actual page section container is all the way up here, which is even bigger. But if we were to use user items list as our trigger for the hover mode, that means that if we touch any area, including all the way up here, the cards are going to be fading out. Now, that's not what I want. That is not my goal. I want to restrict the hover mode to something a little bit closer to the cards. So I'm going to continue working with this container of user items list simple, and I'm going to make this one the trigger for that fade out. So let's go ahead and create our hover mode. Down here, I'm just going to type in here hover mode just to separate things a little bit. So we have user items list simple, and then when we hover over this container, what I want is for the list item overlay. So I want this same element down here to turn its opacity all the way back to 1, which means I want to actually see it on the screen. So now if I hover all the way up here, you can see that nothing is happening because the container doesn't reach all the way up here. But if I go in between the cards where the container is present, that is when all of the images or all of the cards fade out. And then if I go here to the side, same thing happens because that container reaches all the way out here. And then to this side, same thing. And then down here, as long as I'm inside the area of the container, that is when the fade out is going to happen. So before we move on to the next step of the hover mode, I'm going to go ahead and give this a slight transition because right now I feel like this sort of on-off effect is just way too blunt for me. So I'm going to go back into the pseudo element and I'm going to add in here a little transition. And I'm going to set this to all. It's just going to change the opacity. I'm just going to set it to all 0.5 seconds. And now if I go anywhere within that trigger container, you can see how the overlay gets applied. And now to finalize this spotlight effect, the next thing we need to do is that when we hover over one of the cards, the opacity gets turned back down to 0. So let's go ahead and do that here. Now let me write this first and then I'll walk you through what it means. So basically what we're doing here is, again, we're keeping everything within the hover mode. So when this container is being hovered over, two things are going to happen. The first thing is that the opacity of the overlay is going to be turned up all the way to 1. And then what's also going to happen is that when I'm hovering over this container, but I'm also hovering over a specific card, the overlay is going to go all the way down to 0 again. So it's basically just overriding what is happening here. So now if I go into the container, everything gets completely fade out. And then if I go onto the card itself, we get the full opacity back. So there you have it. This is a pretty quick way to give your clients' auto layouts a nice dynamic hover mode, and I have other customization ideas inside the snippet directory if you want to check those out. But you can always build up on the same spotlight effect if needed, and then you can make changes to it, you can add more tweaks to it, you can make the text just go on top of the image if you want to, remove the padding, whatever it is. It's a pretty versatile customization. So that's it for now. If you have any questions or comments, go ahead and leave them down below. Thanks so much for watching, and until next time.